Good morning. Beautiful morning. I've got a lovely view behind you, so please look at me, not out the window. And I'm obviously you're all mitochondriacs. 8 a.m. in the morning is a very unhealthy time. So I've had coffee, so I'm a bit more awake. Okay, so a little bit about monitoring. So there you are. It's all about the mitochondria. So that's essentially the message I want to deliver. So when you think about what we currently monitor, they're the bog standard things, what the heart's delivering, the cardiac output, blood pressure, heart rate, etc. We measure lactate, which I would argue is a good marker of stress, but lots of different causes. However, I think the crucial thing, which we aren't very good at doing in critical care, or on the wards or in the emergency department or wherever, is to actually show that the tissues, the cells, are actually happy. Is tissue perfusion adequate? So wouldn't it be nice if we could detect unhappy cells at an early time point and then hopefully intervene before the pathology becomes established? So a few declarations of interest. Okay, so that's the point I've just made. We know, you get lots of animal models, some organ beds are affected earlier than others, but what we currently use are relatively late. They're global because we tend to look at whole body, they're non-specific, but still eventually they will show that the patient's in trouble. So monitoring cell happiness must be our main goal. So when you look, for example, at shock, the nice physiological definition of shock is the inability to provide sufficient oxygen or to utilize at the cellular level enough oxygen to meet cellular metabolic demands. So there may be a problem with delivery, the heart's not pumping, the patient's bleeding, whatever, or there may be poisoning at the cellular level. So clearly, I'm a big believer of, sepsis hits the mitochondria, other inflammatory processes, reperfusion injury, ROS production, the major site of ROS production in the body is the mitochondria. Drugs, toxins, huge number of poisons hit the mitochondria. You'll hear later on about metformin, cocaine, you name it, it poisons it. Propofol, you name it. So we need to monitor the adequacy of tissue oxygenation, and ideally, if the body's producing, or the cells are producing, enough ATP, the energy substrate, to keep metabolic demands being met. So is enough oxygen getting to the cells in the first place? Is enough ATP being generated to meet metabolic demand? And from a metabolic point of view, is that cell doing its normal job? Is it functioning normally? Because if it's not getting that ATP supply, if it carries on working, it will either implode or explode. So once the ATP levels drop below a certain threshold, that triggers cell death pathways. Or if it's a more gradual process, the cell has an opportunity to switch itself off to hibernate. So you've got this gradient going from the arteries right down to the mitochondria. We can discuss, argue what the precise value at the mitochondrial PO2 level should be, but certainly it's much, much lower than what we're measuring in the arterial blood. So clearly the nearer we can get to the mitochondria, the better a picture we have of what's happening at a cellular or subcellular level. So you've got techniques that have been out there for a number of years, near-infrared spectroscopy, which looks at the circulation, the microcirculation, the oxyhemoglobin there. Tissue PO2, I'll talk a little bit about, and there are a variety of technologies, either big machines, magnetic resonance spectroscopy, for example. You can look at redox state. You'll hear later on, I'll touch briefly on mitochondrial PO2 monitoring. So tissue oxygen, if we measure the oxygen tension at the tissue level, that represents a balance of supply and demand. So you've got the local delivery, the local consumption. So if that value goes up, so you've got this imbalance. So in other words, supply is greater than demand. So in other words, the oxygen's there, it's not being used. If that tissue PO2 falls, again, it's a marker of an inadequacy of delivery to meet the metabolic demand. So you may have a drop in demand, you've got an even greater fall in supply, for example. The net result is this imbalance, and so the tissue PO2 falls. If there's no change, it means there's a balance. It may be that demand is high, but it's matched by an increase in supply, or vice versa. So it's a balancing act. There are a variety of ways of measuring it. I'll focus, more modern technology from the Clark electrode is looking at opto technologies. It uses a sort of fluorescence type technology, which the beauty there, it's sort of plug and play, pre-calibrated, and Clark electrodes utilize a bit of oxygen, so the lower the oxygen, potentially the more inaccurate. With fluorescence, I won't get into the physics, but it's actually more reliable the lower the PO2, so it's actually not very reliable at very high PO2s. This is an animal model we've been using for years to try and look into this. So anesthetized rats, and they get lots of cannulae and lines, jugular lines, carotid lines, etc. We measure, we monitor aortic blood flow, renal blood flow, keep them euthermic, and we have 4 of these probes in liver, the renal cortex, the muscle, and the bladder. Why these organs? Well, we can get clinically relatively easily to the muscle and the bladder. Much as we'd like to access the liver and the kidney, it's a bit more problematic in a patient, especially if they're coagulopathic. I'll just show one example. We published this a number of years ago, so Alex Dyson in my lab, and again, this, dare I say it, nice little animal model. I'll just show you a little hemorrhage shock example. But along from left to right, I don't know if there's a little light here. Yeah. So you've got mean arterial pressure, aortic and renal blood flow, phase deficit, arterial base excess, and the lactate. And basically, at every sort of half-hour intervals, we took off 10 mils per kilo of blood from the rats. And you can see, eventually, you know, the blood pressure started falling, the aortic and the renal blood flow started falling, the base deficit and the lactate started going up. So the rat follows the rules. So you can see here, you didn't get a significant rise in lactate and base deficit until the animal had lost 30% of its circulating blood volume. Rats are hardy, young rats, for example. Rats, they're anaesthetized but spontaneously breathing, and they actually very impressively can hyperventilate and increase their arterial PO2 in response to the base deficit. But you can see here going across from muscle, bladder, liver and kidney, you've got these very early changes in the bladder, and I focused on the bladder, which mirrors the muscle and the liver. Look at the kidney. The kidney is an interesting organ. So initially, there's no change, and only when it gets very severe does it drop right down. Why? Despite, obviously, a big drop in renal blood flow. Because the kidney, most of the work of the kidney is in resorbing the huge glomerular filtrate that comes into it. That 98% is resorbed. And so you become oliguric because you spare glomerular blood flow to decrease filtrate as a way of trying to compensate. So the kidney is a very clever organ, I think probably on a par with the brain in self-protection. So despite big drops there, as I mentioned, in renal blood flow. So again, not all organs behave the same, but by and large you can see here the liver, and the liver plummets right down. Okay, those are rats. Does it work in bigger animals? So, very kindly, Peter Rademacher, he has a pig ICU in Ulm, in Germany. So these are 55, 60 kilo pigs. And we tested it to see if it worked there. And there it is in the bladder of the pig. And just one little case example here, we occluded the aorta, the blood pressure plummeted, the bladder PO2 plummeted, and then when we return the flow, everything improves. And again, it does seem to follow. So now, thankfully, we've got some funding to go into man, and I would have desperately liked to show you some data, but we're actually going to begin next week or the week after, so you know, we should have shifted this meeting forward a month. Anyway, there's the machine in a Foley catheter, so it's got a modified Foley catheter with an extra lumen, and this very fine little probe goes into the bladder wall, and hopefully we'll get results that will reproduce what the pigs and the rats have shown. Quick revision of biochemistry. So glucose is metabolized to pyruvate by glycolysis. Pyruvate enters into the mitochondria where through pyruvate dehydrogenase, acetyl-CoA is generated. That goes into the Krebs cycle, and the pyruvate, if it either can't go through or it is produced in excess by glucose, goes to lactate. So that's where your lactate comes from. Fatty acid oxidation can feed into acetyl-CoA as well. So you get NADH, the reduced form, FADH2, and that goes to the electron transport chain. So NADH goes to complex 1, FADH to complex 2, and it donates the electron. And the electron passes down the chain, and as it does so, protons are pumped across the mitochondrial membrane, and that generates the proton gradient that drives ATP synthase to make ATP from ADP. So most of the oxygen, in fact used in our body, is predominantly used at complex 4, cytochrome oxidase. As I mentioned, some is used for free radical production at the mitochondria, but the majority is used by complex 4. And then the ATP is pumped out through transporters for the cell to use for metabolism. So you can look at the ratio of ATP to ADP, you can look at lactate pyruvate ratios, or the redox state between NADH and NAD+, to give you a feel as to what's happening. Likewise, again, there is a technology to look at cytochrome oxidase is usually in the oxidized form, but again, you can look at the ratio, the redox state of oxidized to reduced. We've been playing, again, in our rats with NADH redox state. And again, you can get online measurements. There's a probe, there's the muscle of the animal. And again, just to show you an example, 10% hemorrhage. And you can see the tissue PO2 drops until the animal demises. This is measuring later blood flow, and you can see there's an attempt by the animal to compensate, so you get fluid redistribution to try and improve the flow after the 10% drops. And the NADH drops, animal compensates, drops, compensates, but at a certain point it goes up and carries on increasing. And again, we found consistently that that correlates with the impending doom of the animal. So you can see right at the very end, and this is just one further experiment where we intervene. Well, this is just to show 6 different animals. Again, they respond differently to hemorrhage. So this is a 40% hemorrhage. We didn't resuscitate them. And you can see some animals, it goes up, stays up, and they go on to die. Others, they can hang on for a couple of hours and then deteriorate. So in another set of experiments, I won't show you now for lack of time, we only intervened when it got to a 50% increase, and the animals all recovered. So again, you can pick the point at which you wish to resuscitate the animal and can induce recovery. You'll hear more about this from Nicole later on. So Mick, who's somewhere in the audience, I can't see him, but he sort of invented this technique. So this is using cutaneous respirometry. So you've got a cream, ALA cream, on the skin surface and wait a few hours for it to absorb, and then you shine light. And again, I won't go through the technique in any detail, but essentially the ALA cream, it's metabolized, and you get a protoporphyrin 9 being generated within the mitochondria, which you can pick up as, again, using optical technology. So I won't go into it in any detail, but it gives you a value that you can then track. So this is an animal model, ischemia reperfusion. I'm running out of time, so I'll hurry up. So again, you've got the drop with ischemia, the recovery and reperfusion. And I've discussed with, are those the real values or not? We all differ on that one, but certainly it does follow the trend. And here's a pig model where, again, the animal was hemodiluted down, and you can see over time, you've got the tissue saturation doesn't change, the lactate goes up, the mitochondrial PO2 measurement goes down, and the blood pressure drops. So it does track the effect. And conclusion. The major components of acute patient management are rapid restoration of adequate tissue perfusion. That's our goal. We don't want to underdo it, we don't want to overdo it. and ideally to try and prevent, if we get the patient in time, new onset hypoperfusion. So we need this happy cellometer, because at the end of the day it's the mitochondria that are key to driving metabolism, to make sure that they're happy, they're functioning okay. Hopefully watch this space as the field grows. Thank you very much indeed for listening.